Bom dia, eu sou Pedro Marin, editor de opinião de Ópera Mundi e editor-chefe da revista Ópera, e está começando mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos. Na última segunda-feira, completou-se um ano desde os ataques da resistência palestina contra Israel, em 7 de outubro de 2023. Desde então, a resposta genocida do Estado israelense matou mais de 42 mil palestinos e levou 90% da população de Gaza, estimada num total de 2,3 milhões de pessoas, ao deslocamento forçado. A destruição quase absoluta de Gaza, no entanto, não parece ser suficiente para o Estado israelense, que nas últimas semanas voltou-se ao Líbano, à Síria e ao Irã, aparentemente numa tentativa de ampliar e regionalizar o conflito. Para falar deste um ano de genocídio, de uma possível guerra regional estimulada por Israel no Oriente Médio e da indústria militar e de inteligência israelense, Ópera Mundi recebe hoje o jornalista australiano Antony Loewenstein, autor de Laboratório Palestina, Como Israel exporta tecnologia de ocupação para o mundo, livro que acaba de chegar ao Brasil pela editora Elefante. Nós falaremos com ele já, logo após a vinheta. Antony, I'd like to begin with the title of your book. What do you mean by the Palestine Laboratory?
So the Palestine Laboratory really is a concept that has existed in many ways since Israel's birth in 1948, if not before. And what it means is that Israel has been using the Palestinians before 1967 in Israel proper, and after 1967, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, as guinea pigs in various forms of control and separation and domination. And Israel has been developing and testing and trialing and utilizing for close to its entire existence, so close to 80 years, various forms of this kind of control. So what am I talking about practically? In the 21st century, we would say things like drones, spyware, artificial intelligence, biometric tools, various other forms of control like this. So Israel is testing these on Palestinians to control them, the roughly 5 million Palestinians under occupation, and that's bad enough. But then what Israel has done also for most of its existence, but particularly since 1967, so close to 60 years, is sell, market, and promote these surveillance tools and weapons to huge amounts of countries around the world, saying that they are so-called battle-tested in Palestine on Palestinians. And huge amounts of nations, democracies and dictatorships have been interested in this kind of equipment because they want to repress their own populations, their own minorities, their own dissident journalists or critics or whoever it may be. So the Palestine Laboratory has become a key Israeli selling point. And we know that because in 2023, last year, these are the latest figures we have for the Israeli arms industry, the official figures anyway from the government. There was 13.1 billion US dollars of weapons, surveillance, spyware sold globally, which is a massive number. It's the highest ever by far. It's growing every year in the last years. And there's every indication in this year, 2024, when we get those figures next year, will be even higher because so many countries are desperate for Israeli technology. And I'll finish on this point, despite the fact that many countries publicly, including since October 7, including in the last year, since the slaughter in Gaza, increasingly now in Lebanon and beyond, despite many nations publicly criticizing Israel for its actions, many of them in the past, and I'm pretty confident many of them in the future, will still want to get a piece of Israeli defense equipment or weapons or spyware.
Antony, one of your book's chapter is dedicated to Israel's intelligence industry. You mentioned a series of spywares and private Israeli companies that made them. I'd like to hear you a little bit on it and also ask what's the relationship between these private companies like the NSO group and the Israeli state?
So in the last year, some people may have heard of the stories around Pegasus, which is a notorious Israeli spyware tool, which is put on your phone, whether it's Android or iPhone, Apple iPhone. And whoever's doing that, government official, police, intelligence service, can essentially get all the information from your phone, talking about photos, text messages, emails, even if you're using encrypted apps, Signal, WhatsApp, it makes no difference. They're totally irrelevant and useless if your phone has been compromised. All those messages can be seen. And Pegasus, or NSO Group, the Israeli company behind it, has been around for around 15 years. And they've sold to dozens and dozens and dozens of countries. We don't even know the exact number. 80, 90 countries in the world, democracies and dictatorships. And these various countries have used this incredibly powerful tool to go after dissidents, journalists, critics. And one of the things I examine in the book, and in fact, one reason why I wrote the book, it wasn't the only reason, but it was a factor, was about 5 or 6 years ago, some people may remember there was a lot of international media attention, mostly in the US, but I'm sure it was also in Brazil, around Pegasus. Some good reporting detailing how Pegasus was now appearing in all these countries around the world. But the way that often that story was framed was, this is a rogue Israeli company doing terrible things. Oh my God, what are we going to do about it? Which completely missed the point of what was going on. Yes, it's a terrible company doing bad things, but it's essentially an arm of the Israeli state. And what I mean by that is, yes, it's a private company. It has a board. It has staff members. It's not controlled day to day by Netanyahu, the prime minister, not in a literal sense. But the way NSO Group and many of those so-called private Israeli arms companies, surveillance companies work is, they're willingly used by the state, by Israel, to further certain foreign policy goals. So I document in the book how in the last 10 years, we can see how Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, goes to places like Rwanda and India and Hungary. The list goes on and on and on, meeting with the leaders in those countries to talk about arms or trade or whatever it may be. And within 6 or 12 months after those meetings, Pegasus is suddenly being used in those nations. And it's very clear, and I showed a lot of evidence for this in the book, that NSO Group is being used almost by Netanyahu. And there are other companies. This is just the most famous. There are many other Israeli surveillance or spyware companies that are doing this kind of work, that it's being used by Netanyahu and Israel as a diplomatic carrot. In other words, they go to a country X, Rwanda, India, somewhere else, and they say, we will sell you this most unbelievably sophisticated spyware. You can use it against anyone you don't like, critics, opposition politicians, whoever. But in return, we would like you to, for example, vote in a certain way in the UN or do us certain favors. And I show in the book that there's a lot of evidence that, in fact, that's how this is operated. Now, it doesn't mean that because country X buys Pegasus, therefore they do everything Israel wants. That's not how it works. But the relationship becomes very close. And as I say in the book, over lots of other examples, not just Pegasus, the Israeli arms industry, in a way, has become a key insurance policy for Israel. And what I mean by that is that as more and more countries, and this was the case before October 7, and I would say even more since, as more and more countries around the world and people, citizens, civil society, NGOs, journalists, more and more of those groups become very critical of the Israeli occupation, its colonization of Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, and beyond. Israel needs to make friends to try to neuter some of that criticism. And the way they make friends, so to speak, is to sell insane amounts of weapons. And don't forget, Israel is a tiny country. very small population, and yet it's the 9th biggest arms dealer in the world. It's not number one. It's never going to be number one. America is number one, and other nations like France and Germany and Russia are higher, and that'll probably continue for many years. But the global arms trade has never been bigger. In 2023, it was something like $2.3 trillion US. Now, Israel doesn't obviously, it's not involved in all of that. They're involved in some of it. As I said before, the latest figures were 13.1 billion. But Pegasus has become a key calling card for Israel over many, many years. So whenever we've seen in the last decade cases from, there's so many countries, from Greece to India, from Hungary to Rwanda, Pegasus being used by those governments, Israel and the company, NSO Group, are directly behind it, and they're using it to try to further Israeli foreign policy goals.
Antony, during the whole genocide against the Palestinians in the past months, it was common to hear analysts on the media insisting that Netanyahu is one thing and the Israeli people is another thing. That is, suggesting the ongoing genocide is something pursued by Netanyahu's government alone and something disliked by most Israelis. Is it true?
No, is the sad answer to that. Let me explain what I mean by that. Netanyahu is one person. He's prime minister, obviously incredibly powerful. It goes without saying. But something I've been saying for a long time, before October 7 and certainly since, much of the Western press, and maybe in Brazil as well, overly obsesses over Netanyahu. We can't ignore him. I think these wars, Gaza, Lebanon, elsewhere, are partly, not principally, but partly to do with his own political fortunes, wanting to stay in power, and not wanting to have any kind of investigation into the profound failures on his watch on October 7 last year. But although Netanyahu, for a long time after October 7, although he's getting more popular now, was not liked by the majority of Israelis, or that has changed in the last few months, his views on Palestinians, on occupation, on the massacres in Gaza are shared by, frankly, the majority of Israelis. That's not my opinion. That's based on public opinion polling for years and since October 7. And I say that, and I go into some detail about this in the book, and I've been speaking a lot about this in the last year since October 7, is the level of dehumanization of Palestinians within mainstream Israeli society is off the chart. It is profound and deep and racist and very ugly. And if you look at most Israeli media, TV, print, online, radio, with some exceptions, and they do exist, Palestinian lives don't exist. There's no Palestinian voices. There's no understanding, sympathy, empathy for Palestinian suffering, let alone Lebanese suffering. There's only our suffering, Israeli suffering. We are the ultimate only victims, and no one else even comes close. The whole world hates us because they're all anti-Semitic, and we are the ultimate victims. And because of what happened on October 7, so the thinking goes, we have justification to do whatever we want in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, God knows where else, Iran. And so when people talk about Netanyahu, and for sure a very far-right, racist, horrific government that believes in endless occupation of Palestine, I'm not by any means minimizing that. But I think it's a mistake to presume that this is simply being led by an extremist government that doesn't have public support. Of course, there are Israeli Jews who oppose the government, who oppose the occupation, who oppose the genocide in Gaza. They exist. Of course they do. Some people will have seen those protests on the streets of Israel in the last months. And that's true. But sadly, many of those protesters, though not all, aren't actually so concerned about Palestinian suffering or Palestinians or the occupation, but want to get their hostages out of Gaza. Now, I understand if you're an Israeli, it makes sense. You want to get hostages who are undeniably suffering in Gaza, I suspect in tunnels now for a year, suffering beyond words, and they should be released immediately. But there's little sympathy for the fact that there's been 40 or 50 or 60,000 Palestinians who have been slaughtered, the vast majority of whom women and children in Gaza, now 1,500 to 2,000 Lebanese in Lebanon, people killed in Syria and Yemen, the real possibility of a military strike against Iran, which God knows where that's going to lead. But so many of those more critical voices are not heard in Israel. And it's this kind of willful blindness. And as someone who grew up Jewish myself, I am Jewish, although I'm not religious. I grew up in Australia. I grew up with this idea in the Jewish diaspora, which frankly continues in many parts of the world, although I think it's changing a little bit, of what I was hearing in my Jewish community, in the synagogue, in my family. I'm generalizing, of course, not saying everybody, but in general, real contempt for Palestinians. I didn't meet a Palestinian until my 20s. I'm now in my late 40s. And that mindset, that dehumanization of Palestinians, which is ubiquitous in Israel, is also ubiquitous in the global Jewish diaspora. And the only hope I have along that issue is that there are growing numbers of particularly young Jews, 18 to 35, in the US and Europe and elsewhere, Australia, UK, parts of Latin and South America, who are speaking out, who say not in my name, who are not willing to be associated with extreme Israeli racist violence or genocide in Gaza. We're a minority, but we're a large and growing minority, thankfully.
Antony, you've talked about these anti-Semitic accusations, these accusations of anti-Semitism. Do you think the allegations of anti-Semitism are used to cover up the actions of the Israeli military industry?
The issue of anti-Semitism is something that I think about a lot. And anti-Semitism, I mean real anti-Semitism, attacks against Jews or synagogues or Jews who have particular clothing on, or just vile hatred of Jews because they're Jews, worries me deeply. And in some parts of the world, it's undeniably growing since October 7, but before. However, and it's a very important however, anti-Semitism has been disturbingly weaponized by many pro-Israel groups, by some Jewish people, by elements within Israel, by the Israeli government, to try to silence criticism of any action, whether it's in Gaza or Lebanon or the West Bank. It's been incredibly effective in vast parts of Europe, particularly Germany, to essentially silence real criticism that many non-Jewish European elites, particularly Germany, but also elsewhere, feel almost hamstrung, completely incapable of saying anything too critical of Israel, even since October 7 in the last year, lest they be accused of anti-Semitism. No one wants to be accused of anti-Semitism because obviously we all know about its history and the Holocaust, and my family suffered in the Holocaust hugely. So it's a legitimate issue, but weaponizing it against critics of Israeli arms industry or the occupation actually makes the real fight against real anti-Semitism so much harder. And if you cheapen what anti-Semitism is, if you cheapen how it's described, for example, there's an increasing move in many countries around the world to suggest that anti-Zionism, this idea that one does not believe in the concept of a Jewish state, you believe that Jews should be safe, as I do, but not in the concept of an ethno-nationalist Jewish state in the heart of the Middle East, that somehow is akin to anti-Semitism, which is nonsense. Can you be an anti-Zionist and anti-Semite? Of course you can, yes, of course it's possible, but huge amounts of anti-Zionists are not. We are Jews and non-Jews and whoever else who say, as I do, Jews have every right to live in safety wherever they may be because of our history, and it's because we're human beings. But it does not give us the right, because of our history, I'm talking about the Holocaust, pogroms, violence against Jews, to somehow dominate and occupy Palestinians forever and somehow expect to be respected internationally. It doesn't work that way. And Israel is going to be facing a whirlwind of, which it already is facing, but it's only going to increase in the coming years because of its actions, especially since October 7 in Gaza, Lebanon, and beyond. It's going to face a whirlwind of criticism and potentially isolation and worse. And to some extent, it brought it upon itself.
Okay, so Anthony, you just answered about Israeli private companies, NSO, and I wanted to ask you, I suppose you know that in January this year, there was a scandal in Brazil involving first MAIOR and Cognite. It was being used by the Brazilian intelligence agency to spy on oppositionists.
Yes.
And also the Brazilian army also had this tool, even though it lied about it, as we revealed in an article.
Right.
I'd like to ask you, what are the implications of using these tools for the sovereignty of the countries that use them, that acquire them? Because, of course, these tools exploit breaches in security systems, communication systems, and I suppose there is also breaches in the systems that use these tools.
The question of sovereignty is a really important one when it comes to Israeli spyware, because there's a few ways to explain more about that. There's a lot still we don't know about what information is kept by NSO Group, the company behind Pegasus, but as you rightly say, there are many, many other companies, and a lot of the coverage in the last years has, in my view, overly focused on Pegasus at the exclusion of many other companies, which were in the past smaller. Yes, they do exactly the same thing. And they're very happy, those Israeli companies, for Pegasus to get all the heat so they can keep on selling their tools to various countries around the world. The issue of sovereignty is important because my understanding is that it's very likely, I can't guarantee it, but it's very likely that when Israeli company X sells a surveillance tool to, say, Brazilian intelligence, it's quite likely that at various points the Israeli government could have access to that information. Now, I say that because in the last 2 years, there's been a long-standing legal case that Apple was trying to sue NSO Group. A lot of iPhone users had been spied on, essentially. I think it was about 1,400 people. Apple was upset. They took NSO Group to court. That's the long and the short of it. And in the end, just recently, which did not get much attention, that court case is now being dropped. Why is it being dropped? Because the whole process it made very clear the Israeli government was essentially working with NSO Group to make sure that no information about what NSO Group, what information they were keeping, what the relations were between Israeli government and those states. Now, I use that as an example to show, and the result of that was Apple essentially said to the court, this is pointless. Now, I'm disappointed Apple took that view. Not that Apple asked for my opinion, of course, but I'm disappointed that they did this because I think that it seems to almost acknowledge the problem. I mean, the point of this court case is to get past this problem. So this is a roundabout way to answer your question, which is there is a very good chance, again, I can't guarantee it, but a very good chance that many elements within Israeli intelligence has access, with the acceptance of the Israeli surveillance company, of the information that client is getting, which is then being able to be viewed by the Israeli company, Cognite, NSO Group, whoever it may be, and therefore potentially the Israeli government, because so many of these companies are staffed by former intelligence unit officers, and particularly Unit 8200, that's like the elite intelligence service akin to the America's NSA. And that should be pretty concerning for countries like Brazil. And it's interesting, you obviously know Brazilian politics much better than me, but it's interesting, and this reminds me of so many other countries, including Mexico, for example. It often doesn't matter who actually is in charge of a country. Now, I'm not suggesting that Brazilians don't care whether it's Bolsonaro or Lula. I'm not saying that. Obviously, they're very different people. Of course they are. And that's obviously up to the Brazilians to decide who they want, for example. But sadly, I've seen in country after country after country, even if initially the use of these Israeli spyware tools started off with the right-wing governments, it often continues just the same with left-wing ones. Left-wing governments, intelligence services, police forces. And what that shows is that the reason why there's basically no global regulation on these tools is because countries are obsessed with them. They have no interest in regulating them. They have no interest in giving up the power. The idea that an intelligence service, police force, a prime minister, a president can listen to the conversations, get the text messages, see the photos of their rival, a journalist who doesn't like them, some annoying NGO worker, or whatever it may be. No one wants to give that up. No one. And I'm not saying that regulation is impossible. I think it is possible. But at the moment, the European Union kind of flirted with some regulation, but it got nowhere, is the long and the short of it. So what you say about Brazil sadly did not shock me, because I've seen it in literally dozens of countries. And the record in all those other countries is it's almost certain there'll be little accountability for the fact that it happened.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you mentioned NSA, the American NSA,
Yes.
not NSO group.
Yes.
And you deal in the chapter of the book that is dedicated to this spyware industry, this intelligence industry, about the relationship between the American intelligence and Israeli intelligence. So
Yeah.
the Americans spy on the Israeli, but at the same time they kind of work together. What's exactly the deal with the American intelligence and the Israeli intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, the US-Israel relationship is profoundly dysfunctional. Now, obviously, that might sound surprising. Some people might say, but it seems incredibly close. Israel could not have fought these wars in Gaza and Lebanon without 110% American support, which is all very true, of course. But good friends also spy on each other. Good friends don't trust each other. Now, I'm not saying that's in terms of friends in your life. I mean countries. They don't trust each other. So the US every day has a section within the NSA spying on Israel, their governments, their intelligence services, what they're saying, what they're doing, what they're planning, and vice versa. So when you see in the last year, for example, since October 7, an Israeli government official saying, we had no knowledge of, for example, recently, the Israeli strike on Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah in Beirut, we had no idea. The only way to describe that is complete bollocks. It's just nonsense. Now, I'm not saying that every single conversation is given to Joe Biden. I don't know that. I can't say that for sure, of course. But the fact is that the US is pretty aware and across what Israel is doing and planning, and whether it's since October 7 or long before. So, yes, on the one hand, the US, since October 7, it was announced this week, has given something like 22 to 25 billion US dollars of weapons. Just an insane amount. Huge amounts of intelligence support, both of American intelligence gathering ships in the Mediterranean, which have been sitting there at various points in the last year, giving information to Israel on, again, we don't know all the details of that, but you can be pretty sure potentially Hamas militants, Hamas leaders. Apparently the US is massively invested in trying to assist Israel in finding Sinwar, the Hamas leader, who, as far as we understand, is living in a tunnel under Gaza and has been pretty much for the last year. They haven't been able to kill him, despite obviously their desire to do so. So the US is essentially, as I often describe it, Israel's lawyer. They support Israel 110%, while at the same time not overly trusting Israel. It seems like a contradiction. And in some ways, if you're Palestinian or Lebanese, you don't care about that distinction because you're being slaughtered and bombed, and who cares? But in a broader sense, there is a real distrust. And this, again, existed long before Biden, and it'll continue long after Biden. This has been going back for years. Democrat or Republican, doesn't make much of a difference in the US. So, yeah, the intelligence services are close, but also don't trust each other. So it's weird and dysfunctional.
Yeah. Antony, in your opinion, you mentioned the Israeli actions in Lebanon, for instance. Why is Israel apparently enticing Hezbollah and Syria and Iran right now? Is it pursuing a broader conflict?
Well, the short answer to that question is yes. The longer answer is Israel. When I say Israel, Netanyahu, elements within his government, certainly many Israeli Jews, though not all, see what's happening since October 7 as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to redraw the map in the Middle East, to, in their view, to a more favorable position. I mean, I would argue, in fact, at the end of all this conflict and destruction, Israel's position will be much more precarious, much more insecure. They, of course, don't see it that way. So what they are pursuing in Gaza is a bit different to Lebanon. Let me briefly explain. So in Gaza, the aim for decades, as it has been for the West Bank, but the West Bank is still not as further advanced on this agenda, is to make it unlivable. Essentially, to ethnically cleanse as many Palestinians as possible. This has been the vision from Israel since 1948. And if you look at the history for the last 75, 80 years, 1948, 1967, now late 2023 into 2024, Israel will take an opportunity to do this step by step. You're not going to remove 3 million, 4 million, 5 million Palestinians overnight. Can you do it over decades? Yes, you can. Do you get Western support in doing so? Basically, yes. No one is stopping Israel now. There's no real handbrake. There's no one. You have people, governments expressing concern. You read reports every few weeks, seemingly, of some embarrassingly stupid American journalist repeating some sort of Joe Biden's very upset Netanyahu. What difference has it made? It's irrelevant. The fact is they're still sending the weapons and backing Israel, the UN, and elsewhere. So I think Israel sees in Gaza the aim, and in that way, frankly, they've been remarkably successful. Gaza's unlivable. Doesn't mean every Gazan is going to leave tomorrow, but it means that even if you start rebuilding Gaza tomorrow, which no one is, all the experts are saying even to remove the rubble will take years and years and years. So that's part of it. The second part, of course, is that there's already been hundreds of thousands of Gazans who have left since October 7. There are still roughly 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. We don't know the exact number, but roughly. But many have fled. Once, when Rafah, the border between Israel and Egypt, was open, it's now closed, I think since May, roughly. But it's shut. But it was open for 9 or so months. Many people fled, the ones who could get out, the ones who would pay the bribes. They're now in Egypt, they're in Australia, they're in the US, wherever they may be. And that's been a long-term goal of Israel as well. Those people are not coming back. That's it. Now, I'm not going to say they're never going to come back, but for the foreseeable future, it's over. The escalation in the West Bank is following a very similar method here, which is trying to make life for Palestinians so intolerable and so bad and so violent that many, some, enough, say, we're done, we're leaving. And even since October 7, many small Palestinian villages have been abandoned by Palestinians because life against violent soldiers and settlers just makes life impossible. Again, it's part of the same philosophy. Make life impossible, almost force people to leave. Not that those Palestinians have anywhere to go, by the way. They just kind of become almost quasi-nomads within their own country. But finally, Lebanon is a bit different but related. A war between Israel and Hezbollah was always going to happen. I was saying that before October 7. I mean, obviously, the last war was in 2006. I mean, it was destructive for both sides, but it's generally viewed that Israel lost that war because Hezbollah was left standing and Israel militarily didn't succeed in its own goals. Fast forward now 18 or so years, Israel has long feared Hezbollah, but did not fear Hamas. Why did they fear them? Because they have 150,000 rockets. They have lots of battle-hardened fighters that have been fighting, in my view, immorally and insanely on the side of Assad in Syria. And what Israel has done in the last 5 to 10 years is to try to penetrate Hezbollah's communication systems. And we've seen in the last month they've been remarkably successful in doing so. Nasrallah leader is dead. Many of their military leaders are dead. But still, Hezbollah still has huge amounts of fighters, huge amounts of rockets. The aim is, I think, by Netanyahu and certainly some in his government coalition, as they've openly said, by the way, it's not like my opinion, they would like to potentially occupy southern Lebanon at the very least. Now, Israel's done that a number of times. It was a disaster every time. Will they try it again? Who knows? But again, the aim is to expand the borders, to never really settle on your borders. And while no one in the world really, mostly the US, is stopping them, the Israeli Greater Israel fanatical supporters, which does include Netanyahu now, members of his far-right coalition, a sizable proportion of the Israeli public, Jewish public, they are taking this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to try to expand their borders and redraw the map. And, yeah, I mean, it's unethical and immoral and brutal and ugly, and as someone Jewish, deeply, deeply shameful.
Yeah, Antony, your book pretty much is about weapons, the Israeli military industry, and how it widely supplies other countries around the world. But I wanted to ask you, is Israel militarily self-sufficient to, for instance, sustain an all-out regional war? What role do other countries play in sustaining the Israeli military? And also, I would like to ask to extend the question to the economic aspect, because there's since the start of this ongoing genocide, many analysts talk about the effects this war, this genocide in Gaza had in the Israeli economy, soldiers being mobilized and so on.
Yes. The Israeli government military is not self-sufficient. That is the short answer. They require desperately American military support. There's lots of good reporting that's been done in the last year which has shown this, which has explained this, which has detailed how essential Israel is regularly demanding, not asking, demanding more weapons, more ammunition, more support. And they're getting it. As far as we know, there was a brief period where Biden held back some bombs for 5 minutes, and then Israel got upset. They released them back to Israel, and here we are 1 year on, and nothing has changed. The biggest provider of weapons to Israel, of course, is the US. The second biggest provider has been Germany. Germany was a massive provider of weapons to Israel. That weapon exchange was happening before October 7, but it accelerated afterwards. And Israel, I think, is talking about trying to become more self-sufficient militarily, make more ammunition, weapons on home soil. That doesn't happen overnight, right? That takes years to do. Obviously, what Israel has also been trying to do in the last years is build partnerships with other countries. So a good example of that is India. India, of course, is now the biggest country in the world, population-wise, took over China a few years ago. And India and Israel are very close. It's partly ideological. Modi is a Hindu fundamentalist. Netanyahu is a Jewish supremacist. They have a similar worldview. They both don't like Muslims. They both think that in their respective countries they have the right to dominate. In India, Muslims, and in Israel, I guess it's Muslims and Christians, but Palestinians. It's also a defense relationship. So what's happened in the last years is a number of Israel's major weapons companies have now set up factories in India to produce equipment and weapons, some of which has been used by Israel in Gaza since October 7. And America is still Big Daddy. If America stops supplying weapons tomorrow, Israel could still fight on for a little bit more time, but they need those American weapons. But those growing global partnerships is partly about saying to try to diversify that support. If, for example, which I don't think is going to happen, some American president comes into power being far more critical or skeptical of the Israel-US relationship, it's hard to see that happening, frankly, because it's not going to be whoever wins in November, Harris or Trump. That is not going to change, in my view, shamefully. But so, yeah, Washington is a vital ally militarily of Israel. Just remind me of the second part of your question, Pedro.
And economically, is Israel self-sufficient?
Yes. So there's no doubt that since October 7, Israel's economy has taken a hit. I think their ratings from Moody's was marked down a few weeks ago. They're fighting an endless war. All that's true. But I'm not someone who thinks that they're on the verge of economic collapse. The West won't let that happen. The US won't let that happen. Israel, as far as I'm aware, is not begging for money. They're not going to the IMF saying, please bail us out. If this war goes, 5 or 10 years, then, who knows? But economically, the challenge they have is actually a longer-term one, in that there really is and this again was happening before October 7, but it's become much clearer since. Israel really is having a profound identity crisis. There is a massive and growing split between those in Israel. Again, when I say Israel, I'm not talking about the Jewish population, not the Arab Palestinian population. There are a sizable proportion who want to live in a theocratic Jewish state, in a fundamentalist religious state. It's not 5 or 10 people. It's a sizable proportion of the population. There are other Israelis who are more liberal, more progressive, some of whom, of course, work for defense companies, maybe not liberal and progressive in my worldview, but within Israel, liberal and progressive. And that split is growing and growing and growing. And demographically, Israel has a problem on its hands because liberal Jews aren't having many babies, and frankly, religious Jews are. It's as simple as that. And in the long run, a lot of those more so-called liberal Israeli Jews who often work for these high-tech companies, for these defense companies, will they want to live in an Israel in 10, 20, 30 years if it looks more and more like theocratic Iran? Probably not. Now, I don't think it's inevitable that Israel's about to become Iran or Afghanistan next week. Of course not. But I think I mentioned in the book, only in passing, it's not a focus of my work, but I have written about it elsewhere, that there has been a real willful blindness within the Western media, and I'm guessing Brazil as well, of really articulating and explaining what is happening to Israeli society. That this is really, in some ways, a war of sorts, Jew on Jew. It's even putting the Palestinians aside for a minute, the occupation, Gaza, West Bank. It's, I would argue, irreconcilable visions of what Israel will become, and Israel's economy inevitably, I would argue, will suffer because of that. And of course, in the end, the only way this situation will end is through sanctions, is through boycotts, is through weapons embargoes. And that's not going to obviously be imposed by Washington next week. It hopefully will be imposed by other states, probably in the global south. And they lead by example. Because without economic pressure, as Israeli and Palestinian friends have said to me for years, this is never going to change here. This change will not come from within. It won't. So I guess that's my answer to that.
Yeah, and Antony, there's another topic that generally has been ignored these days in the media, that is the issue of nuclear weapons. There's a lot of talk about nuclear risks surrounding Russia in the Ukraine war, but not much about Israel. I wanted to ask you, does Israel have nuclear weapons? Why is there so much silence about it? And is Israel, in your opinion, a risk to the world regarding nuclear warfare?
So Israel is an undeniable nuclear state. We don't know, obviously, how many nukes they have, but I think I have in the book an estimation of, I can't remember what I write, but I'll start that sentence again. Israel is undeniable. Okay, sorry.
No, I think it was 200 around.
Yes, I was going to. Yes, exactly. Yes, I think. I mean, you always read different figures because no one knows. Well, sorry, the government knows, but no one in the public. I'll say again. Israel is undeniably a nuclear state. It has probably at least 200 nuclear weapons. There's no inspections whatsoever on the Israeli nuclear facilities. There is a unspoken of sorts acceptance by Washington and Europe that Israel has the right to nuclear weapons, to protect it from, well, it's a good question, from whom, really? I suppose in the past, it would be potentially other nuclear states. Of course, these days it's framed as being against a potential nuclear Iran. And the whole philosophy within Israel, it's something called the Samson option, which essentially justifies the use of nuclear weapons if Israel feels like their survival is at stake. I mean, the concept of Israel itself using nuclear weapons against a neighbor or Iran is the height of insanity. You asked, is Israel a risk to world safety or security with the nuclear weapons which are undeclared? Well, the answer to that to me is absolutely yes. I think as Israel becomes far more extreme, far more theocratic, far more intolerant, and it's important to say that there are some Israeli leaders, even since October 7, who literally have called for Israel using nuclear weapons over Gaza. I mean, the thought of what that would even look like is just beyond words, and also just incredibly counterproductive, because literally Gaza is an hour and a half away from Jerusalem. So I don't quite know how that would even work. But putting that logistical issue aside, Israel's nuclear weapons is the great silence. The US doesn't talk about it. Europe doesn't talk about it. Everyone knows they have them. They're willing to accept Israel having nuclear weapons. And the only way this gets resolved is there is a complete nuclear-free Middle East. And as far as I'm aware, no other state in the Middle East has nuclear weapons apart from Israel. There are other states that have liked it. Saudi Arabia, although they say they wanted nuclear energy, not nuclear weapons, I think it's conceivable that MBS, the dictator of Saudi Arabia, wouldn't mind nuclear weapons. There's been, over the years, nuclear material in places like Iraq and Syria during the days of Saddam, during Assad, the still leader of Syria. So, but at the moment, Israel is the only undeclared but clear nuclear power in the Middle East. And it's interesting in the last while, in this current war, that you have many Israeli politicians, senior commentators openly calling for Israel to attack Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, obviously, we don't know if Israel will do that. Beyond saying I would fundamentally be opposed to that, and I think it would be the height of irresponsibility. But yes, removing Israel's nuclear weapons to me would be a no-brainer, but there's literally no pressure on Israel to do so. And Israel claims that they need it for their protection, and they use the Holocaust in a way as justification, saying, what happened to us, we were unprotected. I mean, we being Jews back in Europe in the 30s and 1940s, and now we're a strong state, we have a military, we need nuclear weapons. Now, of course, they don't say that publicly. In Israel, no one says that publicly. No one admits that. Really, it's not really talked about in Israel. It's mostly censored. You can't even, you can talk about it publicly, but you can't put it in the media. So Israel's nuclear weapons is the height of hypocrisy, and that's putting it mildly.
Yeah, Antony, you mentioned this.
Sorry, Pedro, I'm going to have to go in about 5 minutes. Is that okay? Are we nearly finished? It's kind of quite late here. That's all. Is that okay? Yeah.
Oh, okay, no problem. Then I will ask the final question.
Okay, if that's all right. Thank you. Yeah.
Antony, we here at the 20 minutes show, the 20 Minutos, we always ask our guests for recommendations on books, movies, and TV shows. Do you have, not mentioning your book, of course, but another book recommendation?
Because people often ask me, what's the book that kind of explains everything? Right? All the history and the situation in Palestine, Israel. This book is the one. So that's the book. The film, which I often say, is Days of Heaven. Days of Heaven is my favorite film. It's from 1978 by the American filmmaker Terrence Malick. It has Richard Gere, and it's a beautiful film it's nothing to do with Israel-Palestine. It could not be further away from Israel-Palestine. It's a love triangle story, essentially. And it is people unbelievably beautifully filmed, very moving. And when I was doing my honors thesis at university in the 1990s, I spent a whole year studying this one particular film, which sounds ridiculous now in hindsight, but I did. And it's just a beautiful film, so I recommend people see it. It should be easy to find, hopefully with subtitles if people need it.
Of course. Anthony, thank you very much for your interview. It was an honor to have you, and I'm sure it was very informative for our public.
Yeah, thanks, Pedro. Thank you so much for reading the book and for your interest. And I'm really glad that we could speak and that people will hear it in Brazil. It's great. So thank you.
Eu também agradeço a todos e a todas que assistiram esse programa, em especial aqueles e aquelas que puderam e podem ainda fazer contribuições financeiras ao nosso site e ao nosso canal aqui no YouTube. Sem vocês, o nosso trabalho não seria possível e não faria sentido. Um grande abraço e até a próxima.